Hi, everybody. Maureen Greeley. I am your host for Kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope is a live streaming event produced by the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, and we celebrate cultural diversity and ways to improve access to mental health care for all communities. It's National Hispanic Heritage Month, and we are so excited today to have as our guests three very experts in this field. Please join me in welcoming Juan Baez, Alexia De Leon, and Ruth Yanez. Hey, everybody, how are you doing today?
Doing well.
Great. I'm going to ask you briefly, starting with Juan, to just share your title and why you're with us today.
Sure thing. Thanks, Maureen. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juan Baez, and I work as a problem gambling specialist with the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services. I identify as Hispanic. My dad is Puerto Riqueño. My mom is Salvadoreña. I am originally from Los Angeles, California, but Kansas is now my home. Prior to this, I worked in the gaming industry and community mental health. So I am bilingual, and I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Thank you. We're happy to have you here. Alexia.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here with you all. I am Alexia De Leon. I have been doing this work for a few years now, ever since I moved to the state of Oregon. Launched the Lewis and Clark Latino Problem Gambling Services program, and have done some consulting as well for several years within the field. Just super passionate about teaching about addiction in general and mental health issues within the Latinx community. Happy to be here with you all.
Fantastic. And Ruth, welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Buenos días. My name is Ruth Yanez, and I work for the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC and for the National Latino Behavioral Health Association as a program specialist. I have my master's degree in social work. I am originally from Chihuahua, Mexico. So just like Juan, I am also bilingual. I migrated to the US when I was 9 years old. And right now, I've done a lot of things. I've been a promotora, medical interpreter, and now I am doing macro work with NALBA and the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC in providing technical assistance and to our providers on how to better work with our Latinx community all across the U.S. So I think language access, though, is one of my biggest passions. I want to make sure that my community has access to culturally relevant information because, as we know, there's a lot of barriers to care when it comes to our community. So definitely one of my passions there. So very happy to be here with all of you.
Fantastic. So this really is a celebration, not only because it is National Hispanic Heritage Month, but because we're celebrating such a beautifully diverse community from many different nations and regions of the world. And I'm not sure everyone always realizes that when we say Hispanic, Latino, Spanish, we're talking about different things. We may be talking about geography, we may be talking about language, but it's a very rich blend of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central American, South American. So really excited to get into that today, particularly because Latinos are the largest and fastest growing minority group in the United States, with nearly 55 million people residing here in the US. And that's expected to increase by 2030 to nearly 1/4 of our total population. So this is a community of nations, of groups, of peoples who are going to play a very large role in shaping the kind of society America becomes in the future. And it's critical then to ensure that that future includes quality public health and mental health treatment, prevention, and support. So share with us a little bit, whoever would like to start, about some of those differences between the terms we often hear: Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Spanish. What's in a name? What do we mean?
Thank you. I don't know. I love to talk. So please, with my colleagues in this call, feel free to interrupt me. But I think that, as we were, my colleagues and I, we did met with to talk about, what are we going to address? And I love one of the things that Juan said, which was, I think that we need to let people self-identify however they want. Me personally, I identify myself as a Mexican. We do have the, Latino, which is mostly people that come or are native of Latin America. And then, of course, you have the term Chicano, Chicana, which is someone that, right, it's currently residing in the US, but has Mexican descent. Blood in them. And then, of course, we have the Latinx community, which right now it's a very much gender neutral term, to better serve our LGBTQ plus community. And that is like being accepted more and more in right now in the United States. And then, of course, we have the Hispanic term, which is the term that we mostly see in all of the paperwork we fill out through the census and, through the hospitals. And of course, this is someone who is native or descends from a Spanish-speaking country. But like I said, I think that we are so diverse as a community that is really important that we let our people just identify. I still have a lot of people, a lot of family members in Mexico even, and there's been times where we have this conversation of, how in Mexico, like how do people identify? And many of my colleagues in Mexico are also professionals, and their response to me is like, nothing. Like, if you're not from Mexico, you're a foreigner. You're not from here. But we don't. We don't tend to, call people, or we call them from when they're at, which is, oh, they're from Puerto Rico, they're from Cuba. So to me, I always find that very interesting. And of course, in a way, thinking about how that happens in the US is very, very interesting to me. But that's my 2 cents on this topic.
Great.
Yeah. Well said, Ruth.
Alexia?
Yeah, you said that so beautifully, Ruth. I just want to add, for myself, I identify as Mexicana también, and Tejana because I'm from Texas. And so I absolutely agree with, meeting your client where they're at and using how they identify, how they self-identify. I use the term Latinx a lot because I'm in academia, so I do recognize there's a lot of privilege in that. And it's interesting because even when we were thinking about naming the program, Latino Problem Gambling Services, we went back and forth, right? We want to be inclusive, so we liked Latinx, but also we are housed in a higher ed institution, or we were. And so that may not be like as friendly or as welcoming to the entire community, right? That could be, we're trying to be inclusive, but we might unintentionally be exclusive, right? Because we have more privilege in higher education and access to the latest terminology that academia is using versus maybe what our community is using. So trying to meet in the middle and really honor those obviously ancestors and everyone who came before us, as well as trying, to honor those who are coming after us, generations after us.
Yeah, I agree. It's, with these different terms, I mean, we have so many passions about our own cultural identities, and, it's constantly evolving. For example, I live in a very rural part of Kansas where we have a huge diversity and multiculturalism. However, in many, communities, Latinx is considered a very progressive term, a term that is used more in the big cities, and like Alexia said, with academia. And so it's a term that maybe hasn't caught on as strongly out here, but, it's out there. And so, some identify very strongly with Hispanic, Hispano, or Latino, Latina. And so it's, like we said, it's about self-identification, meeting clients or people that we work with where they're at, and just understanding those differences and practicing cultural humility so that what's out there and what people are comfortable with. I will even say for myself, Latinx was a term that I needed to get comfortable with and really look into what the term meant, and its goal of inclusivity. And so once I seen it from that perspective, I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm very happy to use it. But for many of us who've grown up our whole lives identifying as Hispanic, then that's what we're comfortable with. But knowing that we need to evolve and see where people are at and meet them where they're at.
And let's talk more about meeting people where they're at. Let's look at some of the other cultural issues and values that are important for all of us to understand, but particularly when you're looking at providing services for communities. Talk to me about the importance of things such as familismo, collectivism, machismo. These are terms that many of us hear, but if we're not part of the culture, we may not fully understand because we've only seen what those look like in movies or in magazines. So give us the real picture of how we can be respectful in understanding those cultural issues and values.
I think for me, like just in my own experience in working within our communities, is familismo is huge for us, particularly with mental health and addiction, right? Because we're fighting so much stigma, and just keeping in mind that the entire family system is impacted. And so we have to think about every single member of the family and where are they at developmentally and what is their relationship, not only to the person who is engaging in the addiction, but also, their understanding developmentally of where they are as well. Respect is really huge in our culture as well, especially when we're working with clients who are older than us. I know that that's something that I've experienced that can be difficult at times, to want to challenge a client who's older than me, because that's a big part of our culture. And then I would say the spiritual and religious component of Marianismo, particularly for female clients that I've worked with, especially Latinas, like we're seeing a rise with mental health issues and addiction as well. And so just thinking about, how do those cultural, spiritual, religious influences, how does that impact, how, like what treatment looks like with our clients, not just the client that we're working with individually, but also the entire family system.
So how can that emphasis on religion be both a protective factor, perhaps, for some, as well as sometimes contributing to stigma around mental health issues and beliefs, the demonization or things like that? Share a little bit about that cultural values.
Yeah, building upon what Alexia said, the collectivism, right? Within American culture, things like rugged individualism and individual freedoms are a lot more, focused on, and that collectivism within our cultures, it makes a huge difference of making sure that we engage not just the core family, but also extended family and the factors within our religion. For example, I grew up very much Catholic. And so a lot of things within the Catholic religion are, spoken about, that the whole is more important than the individual. And, with working within prevention as well, we know that, spirituality, religious affiliation serves as a big protective factor. And so many times when, within members of a family break out or, try to move away or that sort of thing, being together and being supportive of one another is so important. So many times, our own things that we want to do within ourselves, it's frowned upon. It could potentially be frowned upon because the family is more important. And so taking those things into consideration to say that, whatever decision us as Hispanics make, we look at it, what's good for the whole as well. So it's not just individual, ambitions or individual things that we want to do, but including the family, so that we stay supportive of one another and we work within the context of our cultural values.
Yeah, I would like to add, I love what my colleagues here are saying, because when it comes to spirituality, I think in religion, right? Because we need to differentiate that there's a difference between religion and spirituality. But in organized religion, in those type of settings, there's so much stigma when it comes to substance use, mental illness, addictions. There's so much stigma to that. And like you were saying, Maureen, you can go to your pastor, to your priest, or other clerical members, and you confessing this is, you're sinning, and we have to get at the demons from you, or let's say a prayer, let's have God heal you. And not fully understanding that it's okay to make referrals. It's okay to say, like, I believe, God put professionals in this world that can help with, things like this, that are, that they trained for these things. And, oftentimes we have the misconception of, well, es que va a pasar un milagro, a miracle is going to happen. And what, like, I don't discredit that the miracle will happen, but how it happens, it's different from everyone. So it may take some more time for some individuals, and it may take less time for others. However, being able to refer them to services, I think is so important, which of course that it's a barrier in itself, right? But even going into our churches and providing training and saying, like, these are some of the symptoms, and it's okay. Like, let's not stigmatize this, because we can actually save a life if we speak on this. And because we are so collectivistic, we know that if I'm suffering, my whole family's suffering, everyone. Um, and there's actually a Mayan proverb that says it's in la catch. So when Mayas used to introduce themselves, they used to say, like, in la catch, which it would mean I am you. And then the person would introduce themselves as Halakan, which is, it meant I'm your other you. So that just talks about how connected we are with our community members, our families. And because we're so collectivistic, it's like, I can't be successful if you're not successful. So, and for most of us, that's like, well, that's the imposter syndrome. But culturally, is it?
Mhm.
Right? And then, of course, there's some protective factors and risk factors, even with familismo and being so collective. But definitely.
I just wanted to add also, like honoring where our clients are and respecting their culture and their traditions, because they might be engaging in more indigenous healing practices, right? And so how do we honor also, maybe they're working with a spiritual teacher, outside, or a spirit guide outside of working with us, right? Or maybe they don't identify as Christian or Catholic, right? Because we're not a monolithic culture. And so honoring, how do we bring in some of those spiritual practices, that might be different than our own, or how do we give them the space, right, to talk about what spiritual healing looks like for them.
Yes.
Yes, I agree there. And even, taking into consideration some of the healing practices around physical medicine, physical health. And the fact that for many of us, I mean, I grew up in a household where my family practiced a lot about, non-Western medicine, which helped us in a lot of ways. I mean, so, if someone comes to you and talks about some of their healing practices, either spiritual, mental, or physical, like Alexia said, to take those into consideration and know that those are very real for them. And it's very much could be helping. So, stepping outside of the box of what traditional, very much Western medicine or healing practices look like, and honor that.
And
Yeah.
let's talk about, go ahead, Alexia.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, we're all obviously, like, educated in this field, and also, like, higher education teaches us a lot of times Western practices and how to be really great for white clients, right? So this is kind of part of that, like, how do we also go back and honor, again, like, what were people doing before us? Like, they were doing a lot of healing things that we don't want to lose sight of.
Yes.
And how difficult is it for your clients to even share some of those practices if they don't feel they're honored or respected, or their view of authority is very different? I know sometimes it's difficult for immigrants to share with a medical practitioner, because their view of authority, what their problem even is. So how do we get beyond those initial communication issues?
Yes, I think that, mostly being, I mean, this is what we do at the ATTC, right? We want our providers to be culturally aware and to be culturally sensitive to the needs of the client. And so as a provider, not being afraid to ask the questions, and not be afraid to say, like, tell me more about that. I mean, I know that our providers are very, like, 15-minute sessions in and out, right? As a clinical professional, you have more time to spend time with your client, so doing those multicultural, and I know there's actually some the cultural formulation questions in the DSM, but like, not being afraid to ask the questions, or even as the gatekeepers, right, of an office. How does your office look like? What does the environment look like to your client? Are you using colors that are very appropriate? Do you have billboards that are very appropriate, that are culturally appropriate? Thinking about these things is, how can we get our clients to, right as they're stepping into our office, right away they're feeling welcomed into being with us, and they can relate to us and where they want to talk to us. And if you are a monolingual speaker, these are things that you can also do for yourself, is just being culturally aware and not being afraid to ask. And of course, we know that it's going to take some time for our people to trust you. That's like, trust is so important to us. And so you may not get it the first round, but then also, if you are in a setting where you can use your promotoras to help you gain that trust, how can we use more of our community health workers to help us with that? Or, I personally, I love the peer support model, because I think that Latinos, we do peer support all the time. We are natural helpers, right? Like, when you want help, you don't go to your doctor. You're probably gonna go to your comadre, or your best friend, or your mom, or whoever is that next of kin, family first type of setting. So I do believe that we are natural peer support um, helpers.
Yeah, like, I think it just goes back to the emphasis on community. Like, before we launched our culturally specific program, I was out there interfacing with my community at, like, Latino health fairs and the 16 de Septiembre celebrations, things like that, just trying to, like, not just introduce myself and show them who I am, to raise awareness, but to show them, like, I'm not any different than you. Like, even though we're housed, in a higher ed institution, I'm still, like, somos mismos. We're still the same, and so I think it's important to have that face-to-face interaction to start building that trust before they even come into our office space.
I agree, and it's so multifaceted in the sense that, at times, as professionals, we might, engage with clients or people in our communities, and there is at times maybe a little bit of idealization and saying, I'm in the same boat as you are. I'm also learning. I want to learn from you, and hopefully you can learn some things from me. And so that trust, many times, people are dealing with language issues where English is not their native language. Some people might be dealing with the fact that they don't have documentation, and so that trust, that clinical trust always takes time to build, but it takes longer with many of us as Hispanics. And the fact that there's the other side, that some of us come from countries where the authorities are not necessarily to be trusted. There might be corruption in some of our countries where the police are, not necessarily to be trusted. And so you're dealing with multiple sides and multiple facets of what that trust and that connection takes to be nurtured and to be created.
So let's talk about that trust when it comes to a certain type of cultural community background, and that's when it comes to gambling. What does gambling look like in Latino communities? What is what is the norm and what is accepted, and who are we gambling with? Because it looks very different perhaps than what legalized gambling looks like in the United States right now.
Mm-hmm. I know. I know, like my colleagues here have a lot more experience with gambling. But I know for me, I grew up playing loteria with my family.
Yeah.
It was so normal, right? Sunday nights, get your cambiecito, your quarters or your pesos, and let's all get together and have a nice loteria night. Or many of my family members that do Avon or, all these like third party, all this like networking, selling. It's like, let's get together, let's have a loteria so that you guys can win a product. So I personally, I was just reflecting on a lot of this, and I was like, I didn't realize how much we normalize it, and then we put our family members at risk because we're normalizing it so much. That is like, how do you know what you don't know, right? Um, so that's something that I wanted to throw in there. Or of course, you're gambling, you're having a good time with your family members, right? You are spending time with them, and again, going back to that familismo, being so collective. We're having a good time. That then, when we start struggling, I would think it's hard to identify it for ourselves because it was so normal, and now we've lost control. And then, like I was saying, familia can also be a risk factor, right? Because now you start seeing that, your son, your daughter, your dad, your mom, they're struggling, and it's like, don't tell anyone. Like, qué vergüenza. Like, how
Yeah.
shameful. Los platos sucios, los trapos sucios se lavan en la casa. Like, your dirty laundry, we wash it at home. Don't tell anyone about your problems. We will figure this out together. And and then it becomes more of an issue.
Yeah. I agree with Ruth, and thinking outside what she said with loteria. I mean, I remember engaging in loteria as a little boy. Playing something called pirinola, which is a little top game. Where my family and I would sit down, and I remember being 6, 7 years old, and playing pirinola, and it was a lot of fun. It was a family activity, and one of the big things with problem gambling is, it's out of all the potentially problem behaviors, usually young people start engaging in gambling first. And then you think about, risk factors, age of onset is a huge thing with potentially problematic behaviors. And so if you have, young kids that are engaging in gambling, which might not seem at first like it's gambling, but it is, then that's potentially problematic. And thinking outside of the box of what traditional gambling activities look here in the United States. My dad's Puerto Rican, and I know people in Puerto Rico, cockfighting is very popular in Puerto Rico. And so, that carries a certain amount of stigma, for example, here in the United States, but it's very popular out there, like Rusel, Loteria, Pirinola, other types of gambling that are not so popular or known about here in the United States, but are very popular in our countries of origin or where our parents are from.
Yeah. El juego de dominó, right? Or
Yeah.
like say, está bien, una vez al año no hace daño, right? Once a year won't hurt.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. No surprise here. Grew up with loteria from a very young age. To this day, lots of people in my extended family gamble. My dad is in recovery. I'm also in recovery. So, we'll play card games and things like that, but it doesn't have, there's no money involved, but that's intentional because we're in recovery. But I think it's, about educating our community because it is so normalized, when we're celebrating bodas, quinceañeras, we're already drinking at a young age. That's normalized, right? And a lot of times this is co-occurring, like substance use and gambling, and also mental illness. So just like providing psychoeducation to our clients, in a way that they can understand the negative impacts of gambling. So that psychoeducation piece, which does work really well within our community, they do come to us with a lot of respect, and wanting help and looking to up to us as the expert. And so we can use that to our advantage. in terms of educating more about the negative impacts of gambling. And then I think the other piece is how our community has been specifically targeted, right? Like, how do we, like, we're at this point, we're reactive. We can't even be proactive because, some of the casinos are hiring bilingual people to work for them, right? And that's really nice whenever you don't speak English, for example, in the United States, that you can go somewhere, for hours at a time and you meet a new friend that you can speak Spanish with, for example. So all of, like, our communities are being targeted specifically with gambling as well. And so again, like, just trying to get out there and educate and just normalize, that like, yes, it's a big part of our culture from a young age, and that there are resources to help our communities.
So how important is it then, because if we start talking about immigration and isolation, if you feel very isolated and yet you might be able to go into a casino and feel more comfortable, particularly if someone speaks your primary language, how important is understanding that when we're dealing with gambling and culture? And also, how important is harm reduction? You mentioned that you still play cards, but you don't gamble. So how important is it to offer harm reduction and not just abstinence models?
In my experience, that's been really helpful in working with clients. And I do disclose that I'm in recovery. I'm not in recovery for gambling, and my father is not either, but for substance use. I do disclose that, and this is a conversation that's always really interesting to me when we talk about culturally responsive practices, is that in our programs and in our training, we're always talking about boundaries, right? Which is very important, and ethics and law. All of that stuff is very important, right? I mean, I really have to teach classes on this stuff, and it's not always the most culturally responsive, right? And so again, it's like getting to that human level with our community of, look, I have struggled too, I'm in recovery too. And for me, I lean more towards harm reduction, because I think a lot of times and everybody's different, again, wherever your client is and what works for them. But a lot of times, people will come in and they'll say, I'm tired of this, like, I just need to quit. And we also want to be honest about that pink cloud effect, right? And the time that they're going to be really vulnerable, and that they might have relapses and they might have setbacks. That's okay. That's part of recovery, right? So if I can identify, right, as being in recovery and just like normalize that from the beginning of my work with the client, I think that that's really big, because in that building trust piece, right? Because then they're like, oh, well, like, here's somebody right in front of me who is actually in recovery. And I think, like Ruth was saying, that's why it's so great to have, the peer support or peer mentor model, right? Because all of that is, they're seeing people, further along in the journey, who are doing things that they're wanting to accomplish. Yeah, I think it's helpful to have other options like harm reduction and just normalizing, right? Because the stigma and the shame is so thick already, especially particularly with gambling.
Yeah. And I love everything that you're saying. And in fact, with NALPA, we have a curriculum. We called it Promotores de Bienestar, which is promoters of well-being. And we have Narcan as part of this curriculum. So at the end of the training, they all get Narcan certified. And at first we thought, we're going to have to be very culturally sensitive, because we do offer the training in both Spanish and English. And we were seeing that with the Spanish speaking primarily, there was so much more stigma attached. So then we were like, okay, well, what can we do to not make it so intense for them? Because I think that's the word, so uncomfortable for them. So we broke bread. When we were doing our in-person trainings, we always made sure that we had snacks available to them, because even those little things make such a huge difference, because they're not so little for us, right? Like being able to share with you like a cafecito. That's another thing. I've been in work settings where, having a cafecito, a cup of coffee with the client, it's been so frowned upon. Like, how dare you? Why would you have that cup of coffee? You validated the boundaries. And it's like, no, you don't understand. If I don't sit with this mom and have this cup of coffee with them, I will not be welcome in their home anymore. And just having a cup of coffee opens the door to so many things. Through that, sipping the coffee, they open up, they start sharing with you, they start being so vulnerable with you. And it's like, you are right. Like, I am struggling. I need help. And that's when we come in and we can come in and have these very important conversations of, like, we don't like conflict, right? So in our community, we don't like to fight. We don't like to confront the situation. And when you are struggling with substance use, when you are struggling with gambling, this can be a very hard topic because there's so much, um, not confronting as in like you're fighting, but like accepting that that you have a problem, and that can be so hard with our community. But when you have someone that you can trust, someone that you can rely on, someone that you can share your pain with, I think that makes it so much more easier when it comes to accepting and getting the help that you need.
Yeah. And I definitely think that's a lot more pronounced with gambling, with problem gambling. The fact that stigma is already so high with substance abuse, and very so high with mental health, but with gambling it goes a little bit higher. And I think it goes the same with gambling, that it's, there's still that level of acceptance that people don't think gambling is an addiction when it absolutely is. It's a behavioral addiction, that is without a doubt. And so understanding that from that perspective and asking, what are your goals for, what does healthy look like for you? A couple of major goals I've heard from some very knowledgeable people that I trust: keep them in treatment, keep them alive. And so if for them, their goal is, harm reduction, if they, hey, what, how can we work on that? What works for you? What does recovery look like for you? And also, like Alexia said, sharing, being able to share parts of yourself that you feel comfortable with in the clinical setting, and letting them know, hey, I am not perfect. I have my own things that I've struggled with, and sort of like mirroring, right, like showing, what that looks like. That many of us have struggled with these issues. I'm in recovery myself. I used a lot of drugs in my younger days, and so understanding that, sort of from a wraparound sort of situation as well. With wraparound, you think about wrapping the person around with as many supports that they need to stay healthy and stay alive, and hopefully stay in treatment. So working with families, sometimes we're taught, you don't want to engage with potential clients or people that we work with outside of the workplace, and knowing that, like Ruth has said, that sometimes that we need to do that. We might need to go to a family event to show that we respect them, that we're willing to work outside of the context of just the office or our 9-to-5 jobs. Go to a quinceañera, go to un cafecito, vamos a agarrar algo de comer, let's grab something to eat, and sharing in those traditions that are so valuable and so important to us as a people.
Yeah. And let me tell you, I think like our community is really good at sharing by like word of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we see that it's working, we will share it to like our vecino, like, and next time we see someone struggle, like, oh, I know this person, they were amazing, let me give you their information. And that we already like we're winning, because the fact that I was recommended by my, the vecina, that I already have a head start on the trust. Because it's like, well, my friend recommended you, my mom recommended you, they said that you could help me, can you please help me?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, just for me, like what keeps coming up again is like this, like how we're taught to, have all these really strict boundaries, ethically. And that just, sometimes you have to be creative with that a lot of the time actually,
yeah.
in our culture. And you have to make changes here and there. I think for me, there's so much self-disclosure, and even, in teaching students, it's like, don't self-disclose too much. That's a more advanced skill. And also finding that in my own clinical work, I do self-disclose because I'm trying to normalize, because we're fighting against so much stigma, right? Like even because we dehumanize addiction in general. And so like for me, I recently lost a tío, an uncle, to alcoholism, but the family was literally telling everyone that he died of leukemia. So I might share that with one of my clients, and it may not seem relevant in, white culture, but that goes a long way for us in our culture. Like we're the same too, about word of mouth travels fast, right? And so just like normalizing, like, no, we can talk about addiction. I lost my Theo, literally like from liver failure, and like he's a father, and he's my Theo, he's a brother, he's a husband, and we need to be able to openly confront what's actually happening, because if we continue to sweep it under the rug, which sometimes is cultural with Catholicism too, for example, if we continue to do things like that, it's only going to harm us more, right? It's going to be a larger impact. And so just trying to normalize, like, look, I'm a human too. And that we need to get the word out, because, we don't want to lose a family member to death because we're not talking about it.
So there's obviously some really important ways that clinicians and counselors need to open their minds, just as we're asking communities to open theirs. Can you share a little bit about what you're seeing? Are there differences in terms of acculturation and generational differences? And how do you bridge those gaps when you're dealing with families that are close-knit, but are starting to have differences based on whether they were born here in the United States or immigrated here?
This is one of my other passions, just talking about acculturation and assimilation in our communities. Because again, I think, like Juan was saying, in this Western society, we're very individualistic, right? You are my only client. But when in reality is, no, we need to understand the person in environment, especially when it comes to our families, because oftentimes, our parents are struggling with acculturation. They can't even say, like, I relate to the culture. Like, I have my own culture, my own tradition, my own values. And then when you're working with a young person that is trying to fit in at school, they might have completely assimilated. And they're like, I'm not from Mexico anymore, right? Like, I'm from the US. I only speak English. I want to look like them. I want to act like them. I want to be like them because I want to fit in. And this causes so much conflict within a family. And in fact, there's been a lot of like suicidality when it comes to these conflicts, because families can't, there's so much, like, they don't feel that they can support each other and rely on each other. And so I think that as a clinician, being aware that these things are real, and not just that, but being willing to have a conversation with the client to say, because, I've heard many moms especially saying, like, me estoy volviendo loca, like, I'm going crazy. And then it's like, no, you're not. There's actually words that are attached to this. This is actually real. What you're going through is very much real. What your son, your daughter is going through is very, very real. Or even within the family setting, growing up in Mexico, right? We had all these barbecues, carne asadas, but our carne asadas included our extended family, tios, tias, primos, right? Cousins, everyone, all the neighborhood. And when you migrate, you assimilate. And because we're taught, no, your family is your immediate family. Mm-hmm. Your family is your mom, your dad, and and then one day your siblings are going to get married, and then they're going to be their family. And so we assimilate. So all those carne asadas that were 50 family members turn into 5. Mm-hmm. And that's a transition. And so it's like teaching them, and always just offering education and talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And building upon that, I mean, like Ruth said about the acculturation issue, I mean, even within our Hispanic subcultures, there are levels of acculturation. For example, my mom came from El Salvador to the United States in 1976. And at the time, she did not have documentation. Now, thankfully, she was able to go through the process and has become a U.S. citizen. But even now, it's much more difficult to go through that immigration process. But she was very much old school Hispanic, a lot of the old school Hispanic cultures. For example, I was born here in the US. And so for me personally, it feels like I'm kind of at times between two worlds, between the U.S. Western culture world and between my old school Hispanic roots. And many times I served as an interpreter for my mom for services, work to, sign paperwork, fill out paperwork for different things that my family needed. And then by the time, my daughter, she's second generation American born, so her acculturation level will be much more westernized and Americanized. And so even within a certain family, you have different levels of acculturation and have to be able to individually work with different people within a certain family and their levels of acculturation, because for some of us it's kind of being, like they say, entre dos tierras, in between two worlds, and trying to join the American culture with our old school Hispanic roots, and providing and giving honor to both of those, because those are both part of us.
Juan, I love the fact that you mentioned the language, being an interpreter, both in the language side of it and in filling out forms. Can you all talk a little bit about, for those who are immigrants or are fairly new to coming to the United States, right now there is a great fear of deportation and there's a fear of filling out forms. So how are these acting as barriers to receiving services for mental health and addictions?
Obviously creates a lot of mistrust, right? Having that documentation on file somewhere. And so something, when LPGS was in operation, we advocated at the state level to change our paperwork process for several reasons. A lot of times our community members also may not have high levels of education, so they may not be able to read and write. And so a lot of times it's, us having the conversation with them and then also trying to fill out the paperwork. Also having a lot more time, in Western culture, it's like you got to diagnose them session one, and then you got to start treatment plans immediately. So we advocated for there to be a lot more time to do those things. And then we advocated for the option to have our clients use aliases and other names. And then they could use a different address. Like, they didn't have to put their actual information down. But we still do, lose clients from the intake phone call to, are they actually going to come into the office physically, because there is that fear of, well, they say that we can make up information, but is that really true? Do we really trust, what they're saying? And so that, yeah, I think, trying to advocate for how can we make the intake process easier, right? And for us, sometimes that starts like at the community level. Like, we're trying to raise awareness, like I said, maybe at a health fair or something else where our community members are, just to simply, get them. There's a lot of work, like front loading, to even get them into the actual office space. So lots of additional work because of those barriers.
Yep, I agree. I think it all comes back to building that trust. And as a provider, being willing to go that extra mile. Because I think those, personalismos, those like bedside matters. Oh my gosh, they matter so much for our community. Like, how are you respecting us? Is what you're telling me, is it true? And we may not trust you until we see someone else going through it, until we see, someone else from the community saying like, I've been through it, I've been through their program, it worked for me. Like, I promise you, it's really helpful. And so it's, it takes some time. So definitely starting the trust at the community level, it's a big piece. Putting out billboards. I know, like, we love social media. Believe it or not, a lot of our parents, like they call it, they're on Facebook. And so trying to come up with, announcements that when they're scrolling, they can see them. We love radio too. So putting these little ads on radio of, to do prevention or an invitation, making alliances with, I know, like with NAVA, we're doing a lot of work with the Mexican consulates. So, doing work like expanding, putting ourselves in those places where we know our people, are there often.
Agreed. Agreed.
Great. So obviously, we need to be advocates. I also want to ask you, in your roles and to help your peers, what do we need to do to work on our own implicit biases, on our own baggage that we bring forward? And what can we do to help eliminate that and learn more so that we can honor and respect our clients more?
I think it's coming to terms with the fact, one big term that is used and has been used is cultural competence. And looking at, that term kind of implies more that we reach the destination of understanding culture. And we never do. It's a constantly evolving process. And instead using something closer to cultural humility to know that we need to constantly learn, that we need to put ourselves out there as far as understanding what our biases are, what our understanding of things are. And if we put ourselves in a mindset that we have to constantly evolve, and real growth happens in discomfort, and that I think includes ourselves. I kind of mentioned earlier the fact that Latinx for me was a term that was like, okay, what is that? And at first I felt very uncomfortable with. But then once I learned about it and understood, this is more inclusive of LGBTQA individuals, then I got comfortable with it. For many of us, so much of our lives had been spent in certain understandings of both ourselves, of how, of what, terms that we use about our own values, and coming to terms with the fact that if that's something for us, that doesn't mean that someone else shares that same outlook. And so thinking about it from a perspective of constantly evolving and learning, so that and allowing empathy, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable with other people and say, what, if this is something I've never been exposed to, or if your cultural values are different from mine, then tell me about them.
Yeah.
Allowing yourself to process them and come to terms with what your own biases are, and being willing to open yourself up to different points of views and different cultural outlooks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Juan, and I completely agree, because that cultural humility is so important for us too, right?
Mhm.
Because sometimes I find myself having tunnel vision, right? Because mostly the clients I work with, yeah, they're Mexican like me, but that doesn't mean that we have the same life experiences, right? Or maybe I'm working with someone who is from Cuba or El Salvador, right? Like there's I can't assume that I know everything, right? Because we're not a monolithic culture. And so I love how you're saying, yes, that cultural humility piece. And yeah, and just being aware of, our stuff as well. We don't know all the answers.
Yeah, I agree. It's like doing your homework, right? Being mindful. Even I know we have this conversation, even like Spanish is so different in different parts of Latin America. And, our colleagues even in Brazil don't speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese. So I know that's something that, in the ATTC, we try to have everything available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, because we know that this community needs to access also the resources. And so just being aware even of like our own biases within our community, just doing, like, if you are a practitioner in certain parts of the US, okay, well, what are the threshold languages in that community? Do you have, because we were saying, Puerto Rican Spanish is not the same as Spanish from Mexico. I know we had this conversation of like a galleta. A galleta in Mexico, it's a cracker. In the
Yeah.
US, it's also a cracker. But, for Juan, it's a slap on the face.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, like being aware and doing our homework, even like addressing like our own individual racism and how we contribute to that, and how we contribute to, like cultural racism, even institutional racism. I know, like Juan, like those things can be very uncomfortable, but they're necessary for our growth. So just being mindful and willing to, I call them growing pains,
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that, or I can't believe I did that. And, but being aware and being mindful is so important.
Well, the three of you are such incredible resources, and you have so much that you've learned and so much experience to share. I know that each of you has included some resources for us that we will put on our blog and our website. So we'll put that address up for everybody. But I want to end by asking you each to share, is there one thing that we didn't talk about today, or one thing you'd really like to celebrate and highlight at this time of the importance of working with Latino communities? So let's start with Juan and then Alexia, and we'll end with Ruth.
That's a good question. I have so much running through my mind, so I'm going to try to synthesize it and keep it short. I mean, keep an open mind with us. I mean, understand that our values, our familismo, our collectivism is so strong. And working with one of us is very many times working with a whole other group of people, our not just our core families, our extended families. And getting comfortable with, stepping outside of the box sometimes, outside of what Western culture has taught us, American culture, understanding that, we our collective, our, community is more important than the individual many times. And so, and coming to terms with the fact that even if, how important culturally informed practices are for us. And even, if you have an agency where, you work with us Hispanics and you don't have professionals that can speak Spanish, get people who can serve as a conduit, people who can serve as good interpreters, people that can serve out in the community, even if they're not credentialed professionals, because I know many times there is a huge need for credentialed professionals who are bilingual, who understand cultural differences. But even if you don't have that, find conduits, find people who can serve as that sort of middle person who understands culture, who can serve our communities, and just keep a lot of these differences in mind, and stay up to date, like Ruth said and Alexia, about, even though we are within the umbrella of Hispanics, there's a lot of differences within those subcultures. And so please keep an open mind, and understand that we are beautiful people, and we're here to live and to exist and do the best we can on a day-to-day basis.
So important. Thank you. Alexia.
And to thrive, right? I just want to say, I think a lot of times there are assumptions that you can't work with this community if you're not part of the community. And so I just want to say, speaking for myself and every provider that I know who identifies within our communities, we are really tired. And we appreciate the help. We appreciate when people come to us, with cultural humility and they want to help out. So don't assume that you can't work with our community members. I want to highlight and touch on what Juan was saying earlier about, we're constantly trying to navigate two worlds as well. And that gets really tricky and really stressful and really difficult. And so I'll speak for myself, and I think my colleagues will probably agree. That's a huge misconception. I love whenever a white colleague, for example, comes to me and wants to help out in some way. I would appreciate more help around that. It's not that you absolutely cannot work with people in our community. You absolutely can. And so, be open to that learning, because that helps us out. And then that's a larger impact on our entire communities.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
I agree with Alexia and Juan and everything that they said, is be patient. And like, I love what Alexia said is, yes, we want to help, but that also doesn't mean that we want to double our caseload, right? Like, we think, practicing cultural humility is so important. And where I know, like, I love to teach. So it's like, I want you to learn, and I want to help you get the skills that you need to better serve us, because, we are thankful of support, no matter like where it comes from. And I think that's something that, in our community, I think I want to give kudos. Like, I want to give kudos to is that we're always willing to accept and to receive the help. We, of course, we just want to know that we can trust you. So being patient. And then lastly is data. Please, like, involve us, because we are growing. You know, we are like the number one minority group in the US right now, is learn more about us so that we can get the funding that we need to fund these projects, because we do have a lot of barriers when it comes to accessing health. And we know that the places that we can go to are often full with like waiting lists. You know, you're on the waiting list for 2 years before you can actually get the support and the help that you need. So that would be my thing, is like a call to action for more data research that includes Latinos, Latinx, Latinas as part of these efforts.
Well, again, I want to thank you all. It is also our goal to help people learn. We want to open minds, but we also want to open hearts, because I think that's where honor and respect come from as well. And we want to help break down barriers and provide quality access to care. So we can't do that without the help of people with your knowledge and experience. So really appreciate having you all with us. Stay on just a minute or two, and thank you to all of our audience who shared comments and thoughts today. We will continue this in the future and continue to learn more together to help one another. So thank you all, and happy Hispanic Heritage Month.
Thank you,
Gracias.
Maureen.